Welcome to the Health Edge, translating the science of self-care. I am Dr. Mark Pettis, really glad to be with you, and I'm with my friend and colleague, John Bagnulo. John, good morning, my friend.
Hey, good morning, Mark. It's great to see you. It's great to see you on one of these really beautiful end of April mornings.
Great to see you as well. And end of April, even though in New England, you still are reminded that winter's not too far behind in the rearview mirror. We are getting more of those nice 60, even 70-degree days. And I just love that 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 7:30 hour where it's still light out. I was out on my deck last night, John, and it was dusk. And the back of my yard, where the deck is, faces east. And so I always get the sunrise in the morning. I'm usually out there getting those early morning rays, all that information that we talk about. And toward the end of the day, the western sun cast a glow on tops of the trees, that yellow orange glow. You don't see it down low, partly because the house obscures it and partly because of where the sun is. So it's this beautiful coloring, which I just love. And listening to the birds out there last night. I've been playing with an app. I don't have a lot of apps on my phone, but one that I have is from Cornell, their bird laboratory. It's this beautiful educational place with all kinds of information on birds and habitats. And what this app does is you hit the mic on the app, and it just listens to the sounds in your environment and identifies all the birds
That's awesome. Yeah.
So I had about 8 birds last night that came up, and it's like, wow, yeah, it was just this beautiful moment of life and
Yeah.
the vibrancy, and it felt really good last night to be dialed into that.
Yeah, they start pretty early here. Like the last few nights, we've been able to sleep with the screen doors open on most of our rooms here in the house because it's been so nice. But yeah, we had a pileated woodpecker start pretty early. So it's like a 4 a.m. wake up call. And then that chorus of, like you said, it's life to wake up to that. And then to be able to go out when I let our chickens out at, 6:15, 6:30 to already have sunlight. It's a very different experience for me than than January and February, when everything's still really dark and silent. So it's awesome. It's awesome to start your day with those sounds of life and that early light.
Indeed. Well, we've been offline talking about this topic of supplementation, John, supplements, and I know in my experience, as yours, one of the more frequent questions that will come up in a consultation or maybe a public forum presentation will come down to, what supplements do you take? What supplements should I take? And it really is a kind of a big black box where I think, as our listeners know, the evidence is quite variable, from anywhere from non-existent on one end of the spectrum, which does not imply lack of potential efficacy, to more solid evidence, as we would characterize as maybe a randomized controlled, placebo-controlled trial, and then, of course, everything in between. And so I thought it'd be fun, John, to maybe share some of our personal supplements, and then a little bit about, what kind of runs through your mind when you're thinking about a supplement, beyond the evidence. Maybe there are cost issues, maybe there are quality issues, maybe there are true of any intervention. How will I know if what I'm taking is helping me? What can I look for? What can I measure? What can I expect to experience so that I have some way of assessing the upside downside of that choice? Because I've had this personal experience, John, where I might look at research on, let's say, Urolifen A, right?
Hmm.
Uh, um, kind of a hot, right?
Yeah, yeah,
The carousel of hot supplements come and go, but interesting research, right? And I think we've talked about this, looking at mitochondrial health,
yeah,
and you might see a small study and say, okay, well, that looks really interesting, a little more strength, quicker recovery after a workout. And so those are things that you
yeah.
are working out. You can actually assess based on your personal experience, but sometimes there really isn't anything obvious. And and it leaves that question of, what, am I going to take this forever? Can I afford taking this for the next 5 years? And so I do think that process is a helpful one to just kind of share and go through. So I've already said way too much.
No,
Um,
that's great. I think that's great. I mean, that's the way to look at things, right?
yeah,
Everything has a cost benefit ratio. Everything has a more or less optimal perspective. And I think it's always the best starting point, how much efficacy is there? Is a supplement really a good fit for the biological systems that we have and the versions of molecules, whether that is a vitamin or a phytonutrient, or are the versions are they going to jive? Are they compatible with pathways that might need something just slightly different on that molecular basis? Or something that's really lost, I think, in translation with all of this is what other substances accompany any given compound in a food, that sort of govern the way it works in the body. We tend not to consume anything. Like, foods are going to be an array, right? That matrix that you and I talk about frequently. There's always that food matrix, which is, there's a synergy there. There's a level of synergy there that is almost never replicated with supplements. And I think that it's a big part of the question. Like, is it going to work favorably on its own? Or in some cases, like you and I have discussed, with certain carotenoids, maybe very unfavorably. So there's all these different ways to measure that risk reward or cost benefit ratio. But I think even before then, what you're saying is, I think really a great starting point. Is there any efficacy? Is it worth the money? Is it worth the time? Or is there something that's a much simpler solution that would work and be part of your plate or your, part of a meal?
yeah, great. And an easier place to start, maybe, in terms of identifying a particular supplement, and this for me was many years ago, how a clinician would think about a supplement, and that was the category of, you have something that you're deficient in. That something was identified by a test. Maybe you had some symptoms, and your doctor gets a B12 level, and the B12 level's low, and the decision to supplement that to bring that level up, in the context of food sources, right, becomes a reason for the decision, and you can follow those levels. So you start low, you bring it up with a supplement, modified diet, and then you just follow that. To me, that's one of the more measurable. It sort of intuitively makes sense. I've run low on something, it's affecting me. I can measure that it's low. Vitamin D, like another example. And what are the ways that I can bring those levels up? And the supplement might be the best adjunct to nutritional forms of that. But for many supplements, that it's not a simple matter of, it was measured, it was low, and I'm
Right, right.
vitamin D comes to mind, B12 comes to mind,
Yeah.
magnesium, some of the usual suspects. Um, but for a lot of supplements that are out there, there may not be a well-established standard or measure. And there you're dealing with sort of the biology, right? As you so nicely put it, John. There are a set of conditions that require or demand um, um, some nutrients, part of a metabolic pathway
Mm-hmm.
that you want to turn the volume up on. Um, until which time maybe those conditions improve, or for some people it may be an ongoing thing, and that can be a little bit trickier, right? Because you don't
Yeah.
necessarily have something you can measure, and it's not clear that something that might intuitively make sense in the long term is going to serve you well, right? So there's often we don't know as much um, about long
Yeah.
term effects. So yeah, how what,
Yeah, no, those really, I mean, those are my thoughts. A long time ago, um, I always, and it worked out that I called them the four I's, the letter I. So these are the four things that I would always, whether I was working with a client or a patient, clinically, or I was teaching, I always said, you've got four things that might warrant the use of a supplement that you have to consider. One would be an imbalance, right? So we're going to take a supplement to try to correct an imbalance, maybe just short term. Look at different pathways that you might be seeing in a person's blood, or you might be seeing a symptom, some type of condition that would be representative of an imbalance. Is there a nutrient that you could offer that individual that would restore balance? So that would be the first I. The second would be, and I kind of liked how you framed it, and I wouldn't call it a deficiency, because as soon as you say deficiency, people are going to automatically go to a set of whether you're going to look at blood, they're going to try to look at blood levels, or they're going to look at maybe like a set of symptoms that would be more classic of a deficiency. But I say insufficiency, so that would be the second I, right? Because sometimes someone might not have, use an example, someone might not have scurvy per se, but they could still have an insufficiency of vitamin C for, let's say, optimal wound healing, or the synthesis of the tropocollagen helix, which you need to help with a fracture, to help the healing process of any bone. You have to first reform that tropocollagen helix, as an example. So you might not have a vitamin C deficiency, but you might not have optimal amounts for that healing process, right? So that would be the second I. So we've got imbalances, insufficiency, and then infection. A lot of times infections, can warrant the use of a supplement. I always think about iodine. If someone has like a long-standing chronic infection, iodine can be really useful at giving a person's white blood cells what they need to kind of fight that infection, because of high iodoral, for instance. It's been well established over the last 150 or 200 years, can really give a person a little bit of a boost with respect to their ability to overcome an infection. So, and then the fourth one is something to just consider, which is isolation. Is that nutrient going to work in isolation, or does it require kind of that synergistic effect that we're talking about? So I always go through those four I's. That's my checklist that I go through to see if, first of all, is it even warranted? And then, automatically, as you have certain demographics where if someone's a vegan, well, I think insufficiencies, you have certain nutrients that are always on your radar, right? And then whether it's infections, whether it's a certain way of eating or a certain lifestyle, it's going to put certain nutrients on your radar for that individual to think about. So that's kind of how I've always framed it. But really, Mark, I think what you and I always talk about, which is that look at things ancestral, look at the lens of human physiology, how we've evolved. We evolved with foods, and we evolved with certain groups of foods that were very nutrient dense, and I always try to recommend those first and try to come up with the absolute best sources of those for any individual, because you tend to have, not only are you going to get an array of nutrients, but you're going to be providing those to the body in the form or the version, and this goes back to like Bruce Ames's triage theory, that's probably going to be more optimal, right? Typically, I mean, not always, but so whether that sunlight is going to be the best possible version of, getting a water soluble vitamin D in the body, we have to use oral vitamin D because certain times, because people just they don't have the sunlight, they don't have a vitamin D lamp. So we do the next best thing. And it might not be ideal, but it's going to be a lot better than being, deficient. So I think you always have to wrestle with some of these things, what's really available to an individual, because some individuals aren't going to eat certain groups of foods for whatever reason. And then I think a supplement becomes, it becomes the best option available. But I always go through those 4 I's. I try to think about, where someone is at in terms of availability of certain things, their preferences for foods or their limitations in terms of what they will eat. But at the end of the day, kind of where I'm at now, after 25 years of doing this, is that I probably eat, on terms of supplements, what I consume are very, very minimal. I take creatine. That's the only supplement I take that would be considered more like pharmaceutical grade. Everything else is going to be one version of a food or another. It's not going to really be a supplement per se. And I try to work at that level now for most of my clients as well. I really recommend very, very few supplements and try to do everything I can to find something that's more food based. Even with iron, I recommend Floradix, which is made with bitters and greens. It's it's what I recommend for people who have anemia or iron deficiencies. And with zinc deficiencies, I try to recommend oysters for anybody. Canned oysters, we're gonna get the best ones we can. No additives. So that's kind of where I'm at now. It's like, what can we find that is food based, that's going to help us avoid any of the limitations of the more isolated pharmacological approaches. But again, these aren't always viable solutions for people. And then we go with the best possible versions of what are going to be in a capsule or some type of like tincture form.
Yeah, I love that analysis, John. And this principle of the matrix, really this incredible synergy between so many nutrients that is still not well understood
Right.
in
It's really
the
not.
nutritional science community. Yet, from an ancestral perspective, it just makes so much sense to be getting the complete package. And we frequently talk about research that has yielded surprisingly poor outcomes, probably based on that exact issue, giving vitamin A and seeing increases in lung cancer, maybe too much antioxidant, right? Vitamin E and not seeing benefits to cardiovascular risk reduction. Also, an example of, wow, I would have never seen that coming. Even the omega 3s, yield mixed results in many trials where we know eating fish. And so there are just so many examples of isolated nutrients that don't provide a long-term outcome that one might have predicted, probably because of the impact that not having the full orchestra in place can create. And then you mentioned, John, and I think this is really important, certain demographics, like individuals who embrace a vegan lifestyle. What are some of the nutrient deficiencies there, John, that become inevitable over time with that?
Yeah, zinc is almost axiomatic, right? I mean, zinc is so damn difficult to absorb uh, from plant sources because it's almost always accompanied by phytates or phytic acid, right? That really, really inhibit absorption. That would be a prime example where if someone is a vegan or has been a vegan even for a year, I think, in there again, and they have philosophically, there's this opposition to eating something like, shellfish, for instance, then I think a zinc supplement is I think it's warranted, and I think it's going to be a really good choice for that individual, even though maybe the zinc on its own, not being accompanied by other trace minerals, isn't quite ideal. It's still going to be so much better than, them developing zinc insufficiency or deficiency. So, that's one. Obviously, vitamin B12 can be an issue for people who are a vegan. And I look at those two, and in some cases iron as well, because it's going to be almost always non-heme iron in their diet, and that's difficult to absorb depending on their age and some of their metabolic tendencies or profile. So I mean, I would look at those two trace minerals, B12, as being like the things that I put high on that radar, for an individual that's entirely plant-based. People that are over the age of 65. I look at certain things that I think are really important, and those aren't always, again, they're not always going to be resolved by supplements. I think foods are going to be a much, much better choice. But, you brought up the concept of omega-3s, and it's fascinating, Mark, that and maybe, again, you can speak to this probably better than I can. And when you look at the meta-analyses that have been done with omega-3s, right? And when you and I are talking about omega-3s, for our listeners' sake, we're primarily talking about DHA and EPA, right? I mean, that's what these fish oil studies are like. And a lot of those fish oils are pharmaceutical grade. And help me, Mark, remember the name of what's the big pharmaceutical grade fish oil? What's the name of that product?
Is it
Yeah. So when you take that fish oil, and I think this might help explain things to our listeners, you're not getting everything that you get when you eat an oily fish, right? And there's all these other lesser known, lesser understood or appreciated fatty acids that have higher levels of desaturation. They're longer. You also, in a lot of these oily fish, get some of these very unique saturated fats that you and I have talked about in past episodes. These odd chain saturated fats. Those oily fish are really good sources of some of those. And I think that when we get older, I think it's really important for the brain, as well as cardiac tissue, and just in general, skeletal muscle, mitochondria, to have a more regular, constant supply of some of these unique fatty acids that you don't get from fish oil, that you get from oily fish, and you get from, some other sources of, let's say, saturated fat, grass-fed meat, for instance. But like, if someone is older and they don't eat oily fish and they don't eat red meat, then I start to look at the necessity for a specific blend of fatty acids. And there are some supplements out there, some combinations that can be put together. But I would recommend for someone that was older to use like a non-pharmaceutical grade fish oil. And it would be something like cod liver oil, which is, it's not refined to that level. And then put that with a certain blend of saturated fats together as part of their supplement regimen. So, again, just to your point, the demographic in terms of lifestyle, food philosophies, then you look at the individual or the population's age, you start putting these things or stacking some of these things on top of each other, and you can end up with, unfortunately, a fairly lengthy list of what you would deem to be necessary supplements, right? I mean, once you start stacking different limitations on top of it, on top of one another, excuse me. And then I always get left in a place where I because it's not in my personality to settle for less than what I consider to be optimal. So I spend a little bit of time just seeing if there's any latitude or flexibility with respect to their food philosophy, their approach to what they'll eat. Are there recipes that we could create where they would be okay eating something that maybe just they avoid because of a taste profile. I try to do everything I can, Mark, to make a breakthrough and allow food to be the primary provider of a nutrient before we settle on supplements. But I guess, and again, I might be getting a little ahead of ourselves here with this, but I'm at a point now where I'm more concerned about like one form of vitamin toxicosis or another. I've become more concerned about that than I would have been 20 years ago.
Mm.
And it's not as though I'm going to see elevated liver enzymes but you are going to see things like people don't respond to strength training as well, or people actually end up being sick more often because their immune system is now just flooded with antioxidants, right? And they can't generate that response they need to fight an infection initially. So, as I get older and I've worked with people for more years, and I look at all the limitations that supplements have, and I start to see different patterns in patient or in my client's health, people that take the most supplements, I feel end up with like the most like different levels of suboptimal health or performance. So I've really kind of, I guess you could say I've pendulumed about as far away from supplements as I can get at this point. But I try not to be dogmatic about it and just say, I don't say no supplements. I just think they have to really be warranted. Even things that, like we talk about fish oil, I've been a person over the years that has almost always said there's limitations to a multivitamin. It's, there's certainly, you don't want something that's one size fits all, because we know that there are all these different nuances to who we are that make some of those nutrients in a multivitamin maybe it's not a very good cost benefit ratio for a person's physiology, but some of them are a good fit. And so if you're going to take supplements, like, don't take these kind of broad spectrum, like one size fits all mixes. Think about what it is your body really needs, and it's going to give you an optimal response, optimal performance, whatever it is your goal is. So that's kind of where I've settled.
Really helpful, John. Another category that I think is not well appreciated is this category of drug nutrient
Yeah.
interactions. And as a physician, I'm mindful that much of what we prescribe, it doesn't always have attached to it the knowledge or depth of what some of these interactions over the longer term might look like. And these might be things like metformin, which is widely used and very effective in managing glycemic control, particularly pre-diabetics. But metformin is an example of something that we know can result in insulin resistance, right? Go figure. That B12 deficiencies with
And
metformin.
folate as well. Yeah.
We know that statins will can deplete CoQ10, even though the research on CoQ10 supplementation and people taking statins with respect to muscle effects, and we've looked at this recently, are conflicted. It's not a simple matter of, if I take CoQ10, I'll negate those effects. That's been my personal experience on statins. So a lot of what is prescribed can have the unintentional effect of depleting, and that it's important to at least be aware of that if you're taking a medication, to do a little research on that, because that can be another edge of that two-edged sword that could be problematic for people.
Yeah, those are really good points. That drug nutrient interaction, inhibition of absorption in some cases, that's very underappreciated. And even things like, I don't know, you probably have a really good pulse for the percentage of Americans that take one form of proton pump inhibitor or another. I don't know what the number is. I mean, it's got to be 10% probably, right? I mean, from what I see, I don't know that I get the best sample size or representation of an American in my practice, but let's say it's 10% of those millions. Honestly, Mark, I think 50% of them, I see signs of mineral or trace mineral issues, right? Just because of how when we suppress the acidic environment that we need for mineral absorption, right? There's downstream consequences to that, and it becomes really difficult to to absorb properly all the the minerals and trace minerals that are so dependent on a more acidic environment in the stomach. So that's another example. But yeah, I mean, it's there's no shortage, right? There's no shortage of connections between medications that you can certainly deem as necessary or warranted for condition, but there are going to be pathways, whether it's absorption pathways or increased metabolic needs, that really get turned on their head once that medication, is there on a daily basis. The other thing that you mentioned earlier, how do we assess the effectiveness of a supplement? That's a really, really important question, because so many of the measurements, right, or the parameters that we use for assessing them, they're not outcomes. And I think it's important to think about, is the supplement influencing an outcome or just a biomarker? You and I talk about cholesterol all the time, and I think our listeners have probably have got at least some of my, take on that, which is I don't really like to use cholesterol as a measure of everything's going in the right direction for an individual's health. Just because someone's cholesterol level comes down doesn't mean that that's a good choice for them, either the dietary changes that they've made or the supplements that they're taking. And I look at that with, some supplements when research shows that, this supplement generated a 10% reduction in total cholesterol. To me, that's, that doesn't necessarily warrant its use. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily working in an individual's favor. I mean, it can at times, and certainly if it were to change the size of the LDL particles and make them, more buoyant and less small, dense, then yeah. But just looking at total cholesterol, and again, there's other examples, but I think that the way we assess the effectiveness of these is a really important point that you brought up at the beginning.
And it's a universal challenge for which I think there is no easy solution for people taking supplements. And just to reiterate your point, John, many supplements might have some really interesting basic research, some laboratory research, measurable effects on very specific metabolic mechanisms, biochemical mechanisms. But one can't extrapolate those effects to macro, large-scale health outcomes, mortality, quality of life. We simply do not know. And unlike a deficiency state where maybe you have a blood test or a way of measuring, the adequacy of what you're taking, for most supplements, there isn't an easy test that will necessarily determine that. And you're left with subjective, how do I feel? I started this, I feel better. Is it the supplement? Is it a placebo effect? Is it perhaps an ancillary change in lifestyle? And so it is a bit of a kind of a one-way street that for some can get, I think, tricky. You start stacking supplements. Each may have a unique evidence, some and often basic research attached to it, but really no meaningful long-term data. These supplements can insidiously start to dominate your cabinets, your countertops. And after a while, you're on 8, 9, 10, 12 things and spending a fortune. And it's like, wow, how much of this is really helping me? And there's no easy way to, I think, assess that for the majority of supplements that are out there. Like you, John, I mean, I've taken many different supplements through the years. And I think the distinction, the way I like to think about medications in general, whether it be something pharmaceutical grade, a prescription, versus something that falls outside that category, is this something I need to take forever, or is it a bridge? I think it's better to think about these interventions as a bridge to get you over a set of circumstances that the lifestyle medicine playbook you're developing is one that will ultimately allow you to, on the other side of that bridge, back off that supplement or that medication. And ultimately, I can manage this with just lifestyle. I mean, I think hyperglycemia is one of the is more common examples of that, as is hypertension.
Mm.
So that frequently with lifestyle modification, the medication that may have been very appropriate, I mean, I see blood pressures historically, John, of 240 over 120, just life threatening.
Yeah.
You can't play around with that. So a medication or a blood sugar of 400, you've got to break the free fall.
Yeah.
But the going in with the intent that this is not a permanent genetic issue, there are a set of conditions that we need to identify and ultimately attempt to reconcile, whereby this medication that will break the free fall will not be something that you need to take forever. And I think the same can be said with supplements. It maybe somebody's taking turmeric or something to help a little bit with inflammation,
Mm.
until which time, they're with dietary change and some regular movement that gets better. So I too have become very discerning with supplementation, though I'm really interested in the biochemistry and the biology of a lot of what's out there, particularly peptides and some of these new molecules. That's a whole nother.
Yeah, that's a whole nother podcast.
And we'll talk about that at another time. I would never hesitate to take something that I think long term could really serve me well, and particularly with more hard outcomes, as you pointed out, attached to it, John. But that's just not the case for most of what's out there. So to some extent, you're hedging your bets. The manufacturer of the supplement becomes the broker. You're going to invest a little bit in that, or maybe a lot in that, and try to gauge subjectively how those investments serve you over time. And there are a lot of stocks that I've sold after initially buying through the years. I just couldn't tell if it was helping me or not, and I was just starting to spend way too much money. I too take creatine. It 5,000 milligrams a day. And we've talked about the research there, and those outcomes are very clinically meaningful and measurable and relevant, certainly, to so many. Another supplement that I'm taking currently, and this is my tendency toward insulin resistance, which I very much track closely, is berberine.
Very good, yeah.
Berberine, this is a plant-based compound. I think it's golden seal.
Berberine's great, yeah.
And so for this tendency that I might have to have a fasting sugar of 90, even though my primary care wouldn't worry at all about that, I like it a little bit lower. And my A1C is 5.7. Well, okay, I'm not a diabetic, but it's primary care is okay with that. But for me, that it's a little bit higher in that spectrum. And so when I ramp down the carbs, put on a continuous glucose monitor, modify that, maybe add some berberine, I'll see measurable changes in a relatively short time. And almost always when I just clean up my diet and lifestyle, I can just back off that supplement and have good measures to support that. But that's something I've used from time to time. It's well tolerated. And bitters is another great topic, John, for us to talk about. Are such an interesting sort of family of molecules. They interact with metabolic health. And then the last thing that I take, John, and this largely through some of the work that you've done. I mean, I've always tended toward a probiotic, at times around antibiotic use.
Yeah.
With some prostate issues on occasion, maybe I've had an infection I've needed to deal with, taking a longer course of antibiotics. Generally, even though I think the research with probiotics is still
It's
somewhat,
questionable. It's very questionable. Yeah.
but I've been really intrigued with the Akkermansia. We talked about this recently,
Yeah.
pasteurized Akkermansia, particularly with its effects on metabolic health. And as this is one of my personal areas of focus, I'm trying that now, and very inexpensive. And I will, again, just track my sugars and my A1C and things that I would be tracking anyway. That's all I'm taking right now. We've got, we've got a lot of supplements collecting dust. Most are outdated in the cabinet.
Yeah.
And, it has a way of happening after a while. It's like, holy cow.
Yeah.
And all this stuff.
I like the berberine a lot. I think that is a good fit for a lot of people. And I think when you get into that category, herbs or herb-based molecules that might have, a subset of kind of accompanying molecules with them, I think I think the options for people become much, much more expanded. I think you got some really good fits for people. I take, again, I said I take creatine, and then I take lemon balm from time to time. It's an adaptogen for the most part, so it can really help if you're in sympathetic overdrive. If you got like a really, really long day, you got a lot going on, and you're juggling several things. Lemon balm can really take that ratchet, that whole sympathetic overdrive down a little bit. So, I like that a lot. But again, I think whether it's ashwagandha, lemon balm, I think sometimes there's really good fits there for people. But again, it's N equals 1, right? You gotta try these things on their own. And what you said earlier really should resonate with our listeners. If you're taking 30 different things, you might not know what is causing what in terms of the relationship you get. So I always say, like, just back everything off. Maybe you keep a couple things in place and see how you feel, right? Just kind of listen to yourself. But I like berberine. A lot of people, I think, benefit from that. Again, there's different things that are more adaptogen to help people with whether it's sleep or their nervous system, making a shift towards a more parasympathetic level of activity. But like you, I take creatine because there's days when I might eat a pound of red meat. I might have a half a pound in the middle of the day, and I might have a half a pound of red meat at night. I know that'll probably surprise some of our listeners, but I look at red meat as being really restorative, really replenishing. I don't look at it as being something that I need to limit my consumption of. I'm pretty active, but that being said, even if I had less activity in my life, I would still eat red meat regularly and in much larger quantities than you're going to hear most people advise you to, because it's such a rich source of so many nutrients that the body needs. It's really basic. It becomes basic cellular biology when you start looking at what we need physically and what our muscles need, what red meat provides. On those days, I might get enough creatine, Mark, right? On the days that I have that much. But I have a lot of days when, for whatever reason, I don't have red meat, or I only have it once a day. And I feel like the 5 to 15 grams of creatine that I take, I think it's necessary. And like you said, I feel a difference. We could look at the meta-analysis on creatine. We could look at the results of stuff, which are phenomenal. I mean, that's a phenomenal resume for any supplement. It's one of those ones that, boy, if you're looking for hard science, it's there.
Probably
creatine. I think you're right.
Very high.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't see any downsides. I mean, you're going to get an elevated creatinine test result if you take it regularly. Doesn't mean you have, you can speak to this so much better than I can. Most people that take creatine at the levels that I do will from time to time have an elevated creatinine blood marker, and then it can raise some flags for people. But when you look at that, it's not causing kidney damage. It's just a byproduct of creatine metabolism,
Exactly.
right?
It's
Yeah,
an artifact, and
yeah,
because creatine is used in formulas from lab blood testing to
right,
calculate, just as people who work out and have larger muscle mass will tend to have a bit high
right,
creatinine because they just have a higher load of
right.
creatine and creatine phosphate in their muscles, and so much in the same way, a 90-year-old woman who weighs 85 pounds might have a creatinine that's well within normal limits, but has a very low glomerular filtration rate because these are the caveats of
Yeah,
creatinine. Um, so yeah, there's absolutely no evidence that creatine, even in high doses, and some of the, as you talk about red meat, I eat red meat almost every day, and I've also been vegetarian. I try all
yeah,
those things, and um, but this is where I'm at and convinced where I need to be right now, and I don't ever worry about too much creatine, and the um, some of the early neurocognitive research and Alzheimer's research, and growing on this robust
mm,
research base of creatine, as you point out, John, is looking at brain creatine levels, which may require much higher daily intake than what can support muscle health and strength and muscle protein synthesis, and that's cognitive function, and those levels are probably those amounts in some of the early trials are 10 to 20
yeah,
grams a day, and there's some interesting potential benefits there. More to come, but the creatine story, in my view, is only going to continue to grow, and I think the cognitive piece will be more emergent in this discussion as that research evolves. So good stuff, John. So just to
yeah,
kind of summarize, uh, and the first point is, do I absolutely need this supplement? Are there alternative ways that I can leverage my diet and the matrix of nutrients to better serve that need that I have? The second, of course, is what can I measure? How can I tell if this is working for me? And that often will not have an obvious answer. And I think then that would beg for the question of, well, if you don't have something you can measure, um, just pay close attention to how you feel, and just keep a little journal. And in my experience, if a couple months in, all other things being equal, everything's about the same for you, I would question perhaps whether that's something you'd want to continue using. Um, I think the obviously the evidence base supporting it, and with AI now, not that AI is perfect, but I do think for the average person, a smartphone is kind of like having a consultant now in your pocket. And so just getting a snapshot of where the research is at, and in a way that AI will give you bullet points and a few references, because often what you'll find is a supplement may have very little human data attached to it. Again, which doesn't mean that it's not effective, but just be mindful of that. And then the last thing that comes to mind for me, John, once you've made that decision, and if you want to go with a supplement, generally I would have a plan. I'm going to try this for 6 months. This is what I'm going to keep track of. Um, uh, but in terms of quality, I would be often I use consumerlab.com. It's um, like a $20 a year subscription, and they do some pretty objective assessments of supplement quality. And the most expensive supplements are not always of the best quality. Many of these supplements don't have the exact amount of of active ingredient as advertised. A lot of them have other things like heavy metals. So having a reliable, objective source you can go to maybe look at some different brands and see which can best serve you would be part of that for me as well. But supplements are hardly the answer, the complete answer for the overwhelming majority of people.
Yeah, I mean, what you said earlier, keep it a bridge, and remember, you're hopefully building a small bridge, not a Golden Gate, but look at it as a small bridge, right? For for a period of time that you n equals 1 can really kind of assess how you feel, how do you respond, and don't look at it like an endless interstate, because that's unfortunately the path that too many take. And then there are a lot of unintended consequences for long-term supplements that are not a good fit for people. So yeah, great stuff, buddy, as always, man. I'm so grateful for you and our conversations here every time.
Feelings are mutual, John. Well, we wish everyone well. We'll post this up at the healthedgepodcast.com, our website. I will put up a few systematic reviews for creatine, some of the things that we've talked about, berberine, for those that might be interested. We really appreciate people listening to the Health Edge. We love our community, and please share this with friends and family, because John and I have zero social media presence. So share this with those you love, and we will see you next week. And John, be well, my friend.
You too. Love you, buddy. Take care.
You. Peace.